Great, well, welcome. My name is actually Laura Foster, and I'm an assistant professor of gender studies and affiliate faculty of the law school at Indiana University, Bloomington. And it's my first time at Force 11, so I'm really grateful to be here. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit today about our work that's going on in South Africa, but I must note I don't normally present on the work. I work with a team of researchers and community members in South Africa who normally present on this work. So we can contest the fact that I'm speaking today versus Kath or Tobias that are coming up from South Africa. So I do want to kind of note that. So what I want to do today, and just briefly introducing our work, is I want to ask a different set of questions. So if our job is to think about research communications and think about how to do them better, then I think we need to ask a different set of questions. And this is coming out of the fact that we are working with indigenous knowledge. So one is, who gets to produce scholarly knowledge? And what gets understood as legitimate scholarly knowledge? And why is certain knowledge produced and not others? And who benefits from the production of knowledge? Now, these questions guide my work as a scholar of feminist science studies, and in doing that, I'm not interested in gender per se, but I'm interested in asking about knowledge production more broadly, and how different elements of power and inequality are structuring the way science and research is done. And these questions also very much guide our work in South Africa, where the team of us have worked closely with indigenous peoples around questions of indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and intellectual property rights. But the question I want to mainly focus on is who gets to produce scholarly knowledge? Now, in 2014, a team of researchers who included academics, lawyers, nonprofit researchers, indigenous community leaders came together and wanted to do a project on climate change. Right? And where this is a variety of different disciplines, different institutions, and much different ways of thinking and knowing about research. So it's a very collaborative and disparate team. And the need of this research really arose out of the experiences that we had working together and with different indigenous communities. And in particular, Cecil Lafleur and William Links, who are the chairmen of the Griqua, indigenous Griqua peoples in South Africa and the indigenous Nama peoples, had really wanted to start thinking about how their communities were understanding climate change, what information they wanted to think about climate change, because as they were making claims for land, they wanted to think about how that land had been affected by climate change. So as a team, we actually really started off in the design of the project as imagining a very truly collaborative project where research interests were going to flow from the indigenous community members and then the variety of different people that were working on the team. Right? And we really wanted not just to think about climate change, but think about the process of thinking about climate change. So we wanted to examine how doing open and collaborative research among us requires very different considerations because we were working across these different groups and with indigenous knowledge. So we started off, we needed funding, and we were able to get a grant through the Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network, led by our own Leslie Chan. Cameron was also involved. And so we finally got the funding to actually move forward on the project, but once we got our funding, we actually had to tweak our project a bit and change our project accordingly. And this really raised questions for us that who gets to produce knowledge? Are those who meet the demands of funders? Right? So we had to do that work. And then we had to get approval from our institutional review boards. And the IRB gave us the opportunity, as many of you might work on, to actually work on the protection of indigenous peoples and vulnerable groups that we were working with us. But we also saw it very much as a chance to strengthen the collaborative nature of the project. And hierarchies of knowledge production have historically positioned researchers as the ones that produce knowledge, and indigenous peoples as the ones who produce merely data. And we really wanted to challenge these histories, so we actually went into the IRB process as a political intervention. And we thought about the fact that we were going to do this, so we listed the indigenous peoples that we were working with as researchers as well as communities that were going to be interviewed. And then we also provided a lot of historical background, sort of contextualize their history and their knowledge within the context of South Africa, histories of apartheid, histories of colonization. So we really wanted to use this process. But in doing that, we actually were confronted by the IRB and this sort of pushing back on our efforts because we wanted to go beyond the IRB, but they didn't really let us do that. So they actually thought of the historical information as superfluous, and they warned us that if we were going to list Indigenous peoples as researchers, then they would have to take the, obviously take the CD, human subjects training modules. And so the IRB, we played around with it, but it was going to be much too difficult to ask Indigenous peoples to actually take the training modules. But in doing it and going back and forth with the IRB, it was a really interesting process to think about this space as pushing back. And it actually asked us to think about, who gets to produce knowledge? Is it those who adhere to normative standards of human subject research and those who do not go beyond the IRB? So we started thinking about that. So as we continued our research, we were forced to also confront sort of the automatic assumptions of open and collaborative science and really ask, who gets to produce knowledge? Is it those who are willing to freely and openly share their data? So we really had to confront this question. So in particular, our funders asked us to report our findings and data in open access publications and Creative Commons licenses. And as scholars of intellectual property rights, we absolutely share this value. South Africa is doing tremendous things in terms of open access and open air collaborations with journals and things. So we really wanted to think about this. But it created tensions among the researchers because South Africa, and in terms of University of Cape Town and natural justice, had been very much more on the cutting edge in terms of embracing open access journals, but Indiana University was more skeptical. Right? And then also really got us thinking about this question. So why is it that just as women, people of color, and Indigenous peoples have begun to more notably produce scholarly research, are we now being asked to freely and openly share our creative labor? So this was another question that we really wanted to wrestle with. So demands for open access have created tensions, but we've come up with different solutions. So one of the things that created tensions was a desire to protect Indigenous peoples' knowledge. So Indigenous peoples have experienced histories of violence that have led to the taking of their lands, histories, knowledge. And this includes experience with researchers. And this means that Indigenous groups are sometimes less willing to share their data, less willing to share their knowledge freely without prior informed consent, without benefit sharing contracts, without collaborative consultation. So to counter these histories, our team thought about developing community researcher contracts. And these are contracts between the researchers, institutions, and the Nama and Griqua communities. And the research contracts are very much to sit down and establish the communications that are supposed to happen between the parties and how knowledge should be shared or not. And for instance, the researchers agreed not to share Indigenous people's knowledge without their consent, to respect their intellectual property rights, and to not produce knowledge that would actually harm the reputation of the community. And the interesting thing was the contracts were between the Indigenous groups and the universities, so they were pushing back on the universities as being accountable, right? And then the interesting thing was the process of negotiating the contracts themselves. So in the way of doing this, what it revealed was how university structures hinder research communications in general, right? And how they sometimes prevent practices of collaborative science. And as contracts, however, they remain limited, they're contracts. So we're still sort of asking, are these contracts actually pushing back on hierarchies of knowledge production? So in closing, our research has made us think very differently about open science and collaborative science. So we take a more critical approach by embracing what loosely we might call situated openness. And this is a way of doing research that assumes knowledge production is situated within particular historical, political, and sociocultural relations. And it considers how open and shared knowledge practices can democratize knowledge, but it also recognizes that these notions of openness have been embedded within colonial histories that actually used these norms of openness as a legitimate tool for taking Indigenous peoples' land and knowledge. So we recognize some of these histories that openness has been embedded in. And it aims to develop practices of knowledge production that are more responsive to hierarchies of power and inequality. And so collaborative research for us might involve these moments of being shared, open, closed, sharing, and restrictive. So for the future, we're thinking we need a more robust notion of situated openness in order to democratize science in more meaningful ways. Thank you.